Our next talk is Zoe Gadon-Thompson. Have I got that right, I think? No, I'm so sorry. I've actually met Gadon. I'm sorry, I've actually met her before as well, so this is even more embarrassing than you think it is. So Zoe is going to talk to you about what even is... Do you want to come up? Zoe's going to talk about what even is a dataset. Zoe is doing a degree in software engineering, and she's also outreach manager at Farset Labs and code co-op co-organizer. What? I'm just going to give it to her. Give it a big applause.
Hi, everyone. So this morning when I woke up, my tonsils had decided to explode, so this is going to be short and sweet if I survive. But they haven't actually exploded. That's just me being my usual dramatic self. Also, my toddler peed on me in her sleep, so the day is only going to get better from there. Also, disclaimer, I'm not sure if it's pronounced data or data, so I'm going to be using both pronunciations. I do work with data most days, even if it's in front-end dev, and I forget that components are supposed to be using data that's returned from the back end. That pretty much explains why I can never find where the bugs are. But I had to learn what a data set was before I could actually use it. So I'm a software developer at Flax and Teal at the minute. I do a few other things like outreach at Farset Labs, and I co-organize a group called Code Co-op, and occasionally I run a tech social that's aimed at families. And I am also helping organize NI Developer Conference this year, and I coordinate a coder dojo at Farset Labs. Occasionally I do find time to do the work that I'm paid to do, sometimes. Also, due to the toddler that I have, I'm tired a lot, so I survive off tea and 20-second power naps at my desk. So I've been in this job for about 2 months, I think, and I found that a really valuable skill to have is understanding that knowledge and skills and progress are not always tangible things that you can see and feel at the end of each day. So most people here have probably started a new tech job, and you know what happens. You realize pretty quickly that you know basically nothing about what you're getting paid to do. It's a really good feeling, but it's daunting and scary, and it's absolutely in our nature as humans to worry about not doing as well as what everyone expects you to be doing. So when I started this job, I started to doubt myself again. I started to tear myself down, which is a horrible habit I find myself doing a lot. Because if everyone's expectations are lower, then if I failed, it would be easier for me to deal with. But this was a really short-lived cycle because it's a bit ridiculous. And it feels silly even saying that was how I felt, but we've all been there multiple times. Hopefully it's not just me. So I just didn't know how to use data sets, and I didn't know how to write code that uses data sets. But that was just when I'd started, and that's actually something that you're able to learn with time and persistence. So I didn't want to waste anyone's time when I started this job. So eventually I did learn that it's really important to ask questions. So Flax and Teal is a consortium of small businesses made up of both technical and non-technical companies. They cooperate together on larger projects. So the first week I was working there, I was using open source tech that would be used in this big project called Datatime. So it's going to be a search engine that community journalists can use to search for data sets. So at first I was documenting and reading code that categorizes data based on geographical location. And I kept reading through and commenting code that is supposed to process CSV files for different purposes. So this gave me enough of an idea, maybe, of what was going on to be thrown into this data project that uses Python to analyze open data. But I still had no idea what was happening. I'm not sure I know now what's happening, to be honest. Because why would I? This is my first tech job, and I'm new, so it was never going to be easy starting out. A lot of what I was doing was just based around reading and attempting to understand code and then using it against existing data sets that are free and widely available. But what even is a data set? Spoiler, I don't really know yet. And how can community journalists use a data set rather than just Googling something? So to be literal and boring, a data set is a collection of related sets of information that is composed of separate elements but can be manipulated as one unit by a computer. So typical file formats we might see every day are things like CSVs, JSONs, and XLSX. And there are a few dozen more that I'm conveniently not going to mention because I don't know what they are. But why bother with datasets? If you're a community journalist, would it be better to write something and produce an article based on reliable open source data that's accurate and up to date? Or would you produce your own articles based on articles that are written by other community journalists? And there are so many platforms for open data, and journalists need to have an easier time finding what they need from reliable sources. So while the data is useful, it can't actually do anything on its own. It takes the force of human nature to create something meaningful, and datasets are just the tool for this. So how can this data actually be used? So this graphic is awesome. It's based on a study about college students in the US, and it's supposed to show inequality between men and women in whatever professions they take on following the majors that they studied in college. So on the original webpage, you can interact with it, and it shows you the percentages and the paths that people took from their major into their careers. So it shows the imbalance between the careers that men and women take. And the title of the article is "Women Lose Out to Men Even Before They Graduate from College." And it's actually really interesting. I'm going to link all the resources on Twitter after the talk if anyone wants to read it. So the article wasn't actually written by data, but the data drives the narrative, and it's likely that it inspired the story. But what makes this interesting is the human touch that goes into the visualization and the storytelling. And having the ability to look at a data set and see more than just numbers and data is something awesome that you can have. So this example wasn't actually created by developers, but developers can do beautiful things with data as well. So a typical data format is JSON, which is JavaScript object notation. It's used to pass data back and forth between the browser and the server. So this is a data set that has information on shipwrecks around Northern Ireland, and there's a cat there to draw attention away from how much text there is, because it can be awful to look at. So this is actually in GeoJSON format, which basically puts a whole load of JSON data onto a map. So GeoJSON is an extension on regular JSON. It just uses geometric objects that have coordinates attached to them. So the giant wall of text is the raw data. And this is just how the computer sees it at a high-ish level. And the data can be viewed on a map as well, which looks like this. So you can't see on the presentation, but if you click on each point, it gives information about each record. So it can show the name, the date the ship was lost, the cargo, the condition it was found in, and a few other things. So it knows where to put each shipwreck because of the coordinates given in the raw data. So there are different types of geometry that GeoJSON can use, and features or larger collections of features can be specified in the data file to create something that looks like this. So each feature, each pin, is an actual object, so that's why clicking on it lets you see the properties of the object. So with Datatimes, there's a few processes you can use to do different things with the data. So you can check that it's within a certain boundary. In particular, for this example, we're going to check to see if that data is within Northern Ireland. So when you run the code, it returns each data entry and shows if it's within the specified outline. In this case, it looks like, if not all, most of them are outside the boundary because shipwrecks are technically outside Northern Ireland because we are a landmass. Science. So the boundary checker process uses an outline of Northern Ireland, which is basically just the coordinates in a data set, and the coordinates are just the outline of the landmass. So a couple of libraries for data analysis are used, like GeoPandas and Pandas, and a few other ones that I'm not confident enough to talk about yet. And it uses the template data from the outline of Northern Ireland to decide if a record is within that template. So CSVs are another commonly used data file, which means comma-separated values. So it's just a plain text file, and it looks a bit like this, and there's also more cats in computers because it's relevant at a tech conference. So this is part of another example data set that has information on pharmacies and their dispensing contractors, one of those ones. So it's a pretty huge file. There's about 6,000 lines in it, and there's a lot of words. So there are a couple of different processes that I'm going to talk through using this data set. One process uses something called low codes, which is a United Nations code for transport and trade locations, and it's determined by international standards, and it helps to identify areas, particularly countries, and areas within those countries. So it's just a way of dealing with geographical data. And since countries can have a lot of different areas, like the US has 50 states, probably millions of zip codes, as well as counties, cities, and towns, it can get quite complex when it's time to quantify data, especially when you're working with locations. So low codes are a tool that can help narrow it down to the country and the subdivision within that country. And things like oil rigs and power plants, specifically Kilroot power plant. That's right, isn't it? That's one here. Okay. They also have low codes, so it's not just populated areas of countries. 5 minutes? Wow, okay. So this is the result of putting that data through one of the processes that finds possible locations based on the contents of the CSV file. It analyzes each line and returns what low codes are likely to represent that record. For example, in the Holy Lands in Belfast, there are a number of streets named after areas of the Middle East. So with a data processor like this, it wouldn't be too unusual for a program to suggest that Israel is a possible location for an entry in a data set, as long as there was an actual value in the record that could be related to it. But this could be an example of false positives, which are actually pretty common when you're working with huge amounts of data. But arguably, it's better to find false positives than to miss something important because you're being overcautious about what data is actually being returned. Due to time constrictions, I'm going to skip this bit, but it's basically finding out why those low codes are being returned for that line. So it goes through each value of each entry of the file, and it looks and it finds what location is likely to be relevant to that entry, and it returns the ones with the highest percentage. So another function that can be used in Datatimes is a postcode checker, and this checks if a postcode is in the correct UK format. So this can be used to make sure any addresses in a dataset are UK-based. Since we know from the last example, false positives can be really common when it comes to street names in datasets. So this is a function I actually helped to write after a really short time on the project. But I wasn't part of the team that had developed it from the beginning, so I wasn't confident that I could have sat down and actually written a function that could tell the user that a postcode is in an incorrect format. But I'm just going to put that down to my lack of experience, which over time is something that you can deal with. But it was actually really useful to look through code and learn what everything else did. And then I was able to add my own code based on the skills of the other developers that had already contributed to the project. So what this code does is check if there's a postcode column in the CSV. And if there is, then it runs a regular expression. I'm not going to explain regular expressions right now because no one wants to hear that. And if the value in the postcode column doesn't match the expression, then it adds the record to a report. And then it tells the user that the format is incorrect. So we think all day, every day, most days, for me anyway. Code is just supposed to replicate the process that our brains go through in a way that the computer can understand. So everything I've learned so far in my short time in a real job they're all skills that I'm able to put to use in Datatimes. So since this is supposed to be a web platform that can help community journalists access and utilize open data, the basic idea is that they can search for a keyword or a tag and the relevant data sets are returned. So if a program can use a data file to find locations, then it can be coded so a user can search a location, and then the information that matches that location can be returned. But what if the user searches a word like education? The program will need to find user input. We'll need to find the user input and then return the data files that are a match. So this is where more complicated processes come into play, and I don't have time to talk about them, thankfully. So natural language processing can be used to show that a file with something like schools or students can also be returned when a user searches for a data set with education. Or a user can specify to only see data sets from certain countries. So regular expressions can be used to filter out data sets that are likely to be irrelevant. So using regular expression to find a postcode is probably a bit easier than using something like natural language processing to associate it with street names or places. So at first, I was questioning why I was being subjected to this torture in my brand new career. But it became clear pretty quickly that being thrown into code and trying to scramble together an explanation of what it does is a really valuable skill to have. It's a bit like absorbing the powers, of other developers and then using them for good, hopefully. So if you can break something, you'll be better equipped to fix it because you have a deeper understanding of how it's supposed to work. But it also shows how important it is to do things like document your code and make it easy for other developers to understand when they use the code after you write it. So one quote I heard recently was, "You're writing code for the developers, not the computer." That's very paraphrased because I don't remember what it was, but it's something I'm going to try to keep with me throughout my career. So what is a data set? Well, I think it's just a tool that we can use, and we can build, rebuild, and we can tell amazing stories. The data set can't actually do anything on its own, so it needs the power of developers and people with creativity to create something meaningful. Thank you. Questions? If we have time for questions, I'll take questions. Okay, cool. Are there any questions?
Have you ever used a business intelligence tool like Power BI?
I'm going to say no. Are there any questions I can answer? Okay, cool. Thank you.